Welcome back. This is Microsoft Virtual Academy. We're talking about getting started with Template 10. And we're talking about two core concepts inside Template 10, that of the window wrapper and the dispatch wrapper.
Yes, indeed.
Let's start with the window wrapper and kind of why that exists, Darren.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned it. So, window wrapper. There is a lot of hidden complexity, really, that sits behind Universal Windows apps, running inside the Windows 10 operating system. And a lot of this was exposed up by the fact that in Windows 10, we actually moved back to actually having windows on for our apps, as opposed to being full screen.
That's right.
These things were still present in Windows 8.1, the concept of core window and so on. But now they've become more prevalent because with these Windows applications, we can actually create an app that has multiple desktop windows.
Yeah.
And that introduces a bunch of complexity that most people don't encounter.
Yeah, especially around threading and things like that. And so where we began Template 10 was the heart of everything is going to be the navigation service. And inside that navigation service really is wrapped the frame. So instead of interacting with the frame, you interact with the navigation service, only for us to realize that it's a common pattern to have multiple frames. And so now you're navigating in a different way, but inside that same window. And so we needed something on top of that. What's the umbrella of all of it is the window. So all of these navigation services then belong to the window itself. The window represents the view, which in the WinRT XAML world is the window. And it also, the view then also represents the UI thread. And so should you create a second view, let's say, second window, then you would have two window wrappers, and each would have its own UI thread as well. And inside those, each would have their own navigation service. I would say 75% of all the apps out there will only have a single navigation service and a single view or a single window.
Well, I think 98% of statistics are made up on the spot, and so 75%?
I heard 97%, but we'll just kind of go with your numbers, I guess.
But one of the key things is you mentioned the UI thread. So it's important to understand that there is a constraint in most modern UI-based systems, which is a control that's rendering content on the screen can only be interacted with via code that's running on the same thread as that control. Now, in previous generations of this technology, that was never a problem because your apps were generally single-threaded, and so you never had this problem. But as we've moved to much more graphical, rich, responsive applications, we now have the need to run other code asynchronously and perhaps on other threads that may be running long-running activities, but we want our UI to remain responsive. So we free that work up off of the UI thread, but when we want to display the results of that background asynchronous operation, we need to bring the results back onto the UI thread before we update the UI.
Bringing the results back to the UI thread, though, is complex because there is thread isolation and a type of security that says if you're not on the UI thread, you can't, not only can you not be in the context of UI thread, you can't even ask for the UI thread. And so now we need some sort of mechanism for the off thread to ask the mechanism to give the on thread context. And that's sort of where it ends up. So you might say to yourself, you know, I'm on a page, I'm about to navigate, I need to make sure that navigation is on the right thread. How do I figure out which view I'm in, which UI thread I'm supposed to use, and what my partner navigation service might need as well? And so now we have all this complexity simplified in just to a window wrapper. And a lot of this code, by the way, that brings things back to the UI thread is handled for you by Template 10 behind the scenes. And so often I will use, let's say, bindable base. We'll talk about how the full MVVM layout works in Template 10 in another session. But one of them is bindable base, and one of its core features is when I raise a change, I raise that change in the context of the UI thread that model currently exists, right? That's work that you would have to write as a developer anyway. Pretty sophisticated stuff that you don't write until you get an error anyway. But you get that error, let's just say, a lot less thanks to Template 10. There may be some edge cases where you still implement it, but most of you won't now because of the way Template 10 works. One other thing that's really good is the idea of suspension. And so as I go in to suspend and resume my application, one of the things I need to do is suspend the current page and allow that page and its view model to do whatever it does at suspension. But I might have 2, 3, 4, whatever your application has as far as active pages in a navigation service. And so it allows me to go to a window, and again, Template 10 does this for you behind the scenes. Go to that window, say, give me all the view services are all the navigation services that you currently have and go through each and call suspend. And so each one of them gets called along the way, again, inside the right thread and everything else that's necessary. And so you might think to yourself, why would this window wrapper exist? I find myself never calling it. You can go to GitHub, look at the template 10 source code. It's being called everywhere for you because it want to make sure everything is rallied together the way it's supposed to.
It's one of the foundations. And I think we were all surprised just how much effort we actually had to put into bringing all of this stuff together.
Yeah.
You know, during the early parts, we kept finding all the scenarios where, hey, we can't find the current window. Why?
Yeah.
Because we don't have context at this point. So we've got to create something that will allow us to do so. So,
especially from inside a view model, which is natively out of context. And
yes.
we do that on purpose.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so
appear to win the window dispatch or the window wrapper is the dispatcher wrapper. And so the dispatcher wrapper, unlike the window wrapper is solving a very, very complex problem. The dispatcher wrapper is not. The dispatcher wrapper is just simplifying a complex problem. And so right now, if you were to dispatch, that is to run some sort of operation on the UI thread, you would call run task async or something. Run async, yeah, right off of the core dispatcher. So you'd have to go find the dispatcher and then run it. And it's very awkward syntax. So we've added a handful of overloads so that you can await the dispatch as well as just fire and forget that dispatch if you don't want to have asynchronous code at all because you're doing it maybe in a getter or setter of a property. So when you look at the window wrapper, know that it's solving a very complex problem and giving you a lot of capabilities, but especially giving template 10 a lot of capabilities. When you see the dispatch wrapper, just know that it's meant to simplify the dispatch operation. So when you're ready to do execute an operation on the UI thread, find the dispatch wrapper, which in any view model is the dispatcher property injected for you by template 10. And you can just say dispatcher.dispatch, and you're using all the simplified methods from the dispatcher wrapper.
It's probably worth mentioning just why we needed to do this in the first place. If you're familiar with Silverlight and WPF and so on, there used to be the ability to get dispatcher current. So you could always get to the current dispatcher wherever you happen to be.
Yeah.
Because of the complexities now with multiple windows and so on and so forth, that facility doesn't exist by default. Instead, each UI element, and it may be a lower level item than that, has a dispatcher property that allows you to get the dispatcher that's attached to a particular UI element, which means you can access it simply in the code behind, but you can't, as you mentioned, in something that is a view model that is being attached as a data context. The view model itself inherently doesn't have access to that unless you pass it across. So what we're doing is behind the scenes determining the dispatcher for the view to which the view model is currently attached and then mapping all of that stuff around. So that's why we're having to do it, in case that's a question that's in everybody's head.
Yeah, and it may look to you like we're splitting the atom here, but it's really not that sophisticated. You can see our implementation, and it's pretty straightforward. This is the sort of code that you would end up writing, and we've just written it for you is all. And so, again, we have window.current, so it allows you to find that window, but we also have window.current as a series of overloads, so you can find the window for a frame you have a reference to or something like that as well. So it's really, really nice. And dispatcher wrapper.current, just like in Silverlight, that brings you the one for the UI thread that you're currently in. Pretty nice.
Yep.
Pretty clean. Those are why those two exist. They're really helpers for you. They're an important part of template 10. Now you know.
Have fun.